Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning for those of you that are joining us from a little further away. My name is Victoire Rio, and I am delighted to welcome you to what I believe is the second panel of this 10th edition of the Palestine Digital Activism Forum. I'm joined by three wonderful panelists, which you heard about. We've got Nadim Nashif, Hamle's founder and executive director, who has been at the forefront of documenting digital rights abuses for well over a decade now. Dr. Mark Owen-Jones, who is Associate Professor of Media Analytics at Northwestern University and a prominent expert on disinformation, digital authoritarianism, and political oppression in the Middle East. And last but not least, we have Alay Sassanian, a senior software engineer who spent a lot of time at Meta across Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp, and experienced many of the issues that we will be discussing today from within the company. So as you all too aware, social media platforms have become a battleground. We have various actors that are seeking to control and weaponize the narrative, whether it is to edit the historical record and prevent the documentation of war crimes or human rights abuses, or to disinform and manipulate people's views and with it their actions. From Myanmar to Gaza, now Sudan, we're increasingly seeing genocides play out on social media. So at the heart of today's discussion is this notion that platforms are not neutral, that they are parties to the situation and can be complicit, be it via their policies, their algorithms, their practices, but also via their corporate interest and their internal politics. So over the next hour, we'll be hearing from our speakers about how exactly platforms have been contributing in the context of the Gaza genocide. And we'll also look for concrete pathways to hold platform accountable. I'll also try to keep some time for questions. So if you have questions, please feel free to send them along and we will try to address them at the end. Nadim, I'd like to start with you. Things have changed quite a lot over the last 2 decades, both in Palestine, but also globally. We've gone from the war on terror to October 7, and now Trump 2.0, and its growing alliance with the Israeli authorities, as well as the emergence of what has been pretty happily branded the oligarchy, as US tech companies increasingly side with Trump. I wonder if you could start by outlining for us what you see as the primary ways that US tech companies have undermined Palestinian rights, and maybe touch a bit on where you think that we are headed.
Yes, thank you, Victoire. I think we need to look back for more than a decade or more ago and to see the roots of the problem at the beginning, because now we are speaking about the politics that's happening in the time of Trump era and the changes of the geopolitics and their impact on companies. But we should actually go a little bit back in time, specifically when we are monitoring social media platforms and how those policies developed during the years, because we are speaking about companies who were created after 9/11 in the early 2000s, and with lots of mentality of American mentality. Obviously, we are speaking about companies that, by the large majority of them, that are American. And very impacted from the American ecosystem and the politics and the legal system. And to that extent, what was happening there in the development of their policies and content moderation policies, in the background, there was a suspicious look, a hostile look in a way, I would say, and even a discriminatory one towards Arabic language in general and the region in general. Again, we're talking about companies that started a few years after 9/11, and the idea of war and terror, and that the terror is coming mainly from the Arab/Muslim regions, and that this language should be over-moderated, etc., etc. It's impacted in the end of the day of having an over-moderation and a very strong Arabic classifier with the emphasis on certain keywords like Shaheed and Muqawami, etc. And as the rest of that Lots of content was not approved. So this is historically the look to our region. But while on the other side, there were and there are still very strong ties between those American companies and the Israeli market. And in Israel in general, I mean, we're speaking about ties that are very strongly embedded with the Israeli technological scene, the market in general, in ads and in many cooperations that are happening there. And obviously, on top of all of that is the political connection and the political strong ties that is there between the companies, the high-tech sector in general, and the Israeli politicians. They often are visiting those companies, meeting the CEOs and the presidents of those companies, including the social media ones and Meta in our case and for the purpose of our discussion. I think we all saw a decade of over-moderation on Arabic content, specifically on Palestinian narratives. This is not something that news for anybody of us. Hamle and other partners have been fighting this for many years. But on the same time, while they were having this strong content moderation on Arabic, or over-moderation, I would call it, trying to silence the Palestinian narrative, they were allowing the Hebrew incitement that was influencing their websites. I'm talking specifically about Meta. And in Meta, this is something that was not dealt with. The Hebrew classifier that was declared only in summer 23, right? I mean, we're speaking about content moderation issues in Arabic language and Palestinian since 2015, I think. So it's almost a decade after they started paying attention to that. And to our checks and to the things that we have been following on the platform, they're not really dealing with it in a good way, in an efficient way until this day, despite the genocidal rhetoric and all the phenomena that have been documented by Hamle and have been shown in the different reports. I think, and during the war, I mean, we saw this is not something that just Hamle and human rights organizations are saying. We are speaking about leaks that were published in Wall Street Journal and other reports, like how the framing was inside the company, like who are the bad guys in this situation and who are the good guys and to whom the company is aligning themselves. And clearly, when they putting down the threshold from 80% assurance that the content is violating and changing that, playing with the machine to have it in 25%, it's clearly that they are in Arabic, obviously, and in Palestine and the countries around it. So clearly they are taking a strong position, adding to that the racism in AI, the different phenomena, of translating Palestinian to terrorist and other phenomena. So this is just a clearly example. And we are talking about Meta, but to large extent, it's very similar also with the other companies. Now, the issue, just the last point I want to stress is the issue that we are moving into also an era that is very complicated in a sense that even a certain, if they pretended that they care about human rights before the Trump era, clearly for us, the mask is dropped, and now they don't care, even not in a declarative way. They have now an approach that is clearly, toward profit, toward aligning themselves with the extreme U.S. government politics, and if this means like to harm certain populations, and we are speaking now global, not just related to Palestine or the area, if this will harm people by not allowing fact checkers to keep the cooperation, harming certain vulnerable population in the U.S. and outside of the U.S., and other harmful policies that they are proud of, and publicly we saw Mark Zuckerberg in January 25, announcing those policies. So this is the background that we are acting in, and it means that also as civic society, as people from different aspects, we need also to rethink our strategies and move forward to a different era that we are struggling with those companies and maybe new tactics and new approaches.
Thank you so much, Nadim. And we'll get back to what was going on inside Meta with Lace in a second. But before that, I want to turn to you, Mark. You took a pretty forensic look at many of the disinformation campaigns that have surrounded the Gaza genocide. I wonder if you could take us through a few of the key examples and perhaps the impact that you saw happen, as well as how you saw the companies respond.
On this panel. I think this one I'd like to mention simply because, and I can talk about a few, but I feel like this one captures a lot of the elements of the type of disinformation, fake news, but also social media manipulation that we've seen. Back in 2024, I started analyzing an online campaign that was running across X, it was running across Instagram, and it was running across Facebook. And it was essentially a series of Facebook accounts, Facebook pages. Some were purporting to be sort of news organizations, and some were purporting to be, like these kind of new edgy news aggregating sites. And soon began to discover that there was clearly lots of fake accounts, lots of bots being used to deploy specific narratives. Now, these narratives range from a number of things, including trying to discredit the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. Many of them were posting on the Facebook pages of African-American lawmakers, so congressmen. And, they were sort of engaging in a number of different behaviors. And there was also a series of websites set up around this campaign that was explicitly promoting Islamophobia in North America. They were promoting anti-immigration narratives. Now, what I think is particularly interesting about this campaign, I documented it, looking at a lot of the bots, and then subsequently other organizations like DFR Lab and Fake Reporter did subsequent reporting. So between us, we got a really large picture of this network. And what's really interesting about it is that several months later, the network was actually attributed to a company based in Tel Aviv called Stoic, who had been contracted by the Ministry of Diaspora Affairs in combating anti-Semitism in Israel. So essentially we have now an explicit evidence, which is really hard in this kind of world, to find linking the Israeli government specifically to a paid influence campaign across multiple social media platforms, spreading really problematic content. Now, the content aspect here is really important because, firstly, some of it was attempting to divide African American support for the Palestinian cause by targeting African American lawmakers. Some of it was explicitly trying to promote anti-Muslim and anti-Arab sentiment, so hate speech in North America. And some of it was trying to, again, discredit and trying to remove support to the UN RWA, who, as you know, obviously are an important lifeline for Palestinians. Right? And so this campaign, which was government-backed, and now this is really important, was essentially mobilizing these social media platforms for hate speech and for increasing and potentially inciting violence against minorities. Now, this was documented. OpenAI also acknowledged that their platform was being used to produce a lot of this content, so we're seeing a lot of the AI content. And Meta even recognized that this platform was in violation of their policies. Now, beyond just taking these accounts down, what consequences there have been for social media companies who've enabled governments, such as the Israeli government in this case, to actually weaponize their platforms for hate speech. Now, we saw, going back to what happened in Myanmar, Facebook took a level of responsibility, or at least acknowledgement of the role Facebook played in the genocide of the Rohingya. But now we have a genocide in Gaza, and we're seeing the Israeli government deliberately use these platforms and get caught doing so to spread the kind of speech that enables genocide, and absolutely no accountability towards that. So, I think one of the arguments I have to say is, one, there's absolute inadequate accountability despite evidence for these platforms, but also the fact that we need to sort of start to think what this information warfare is. It's one thing for platforms not to, censor content or hate speech, but if that hate speech is being done in the name or alongside justifying genocide, I think then it qualifies as a different form of content. And as such, it needs to be taken more seriously. But I think this is an emblematic of a campaign where, yes, we see documentation in the public sphere. Yes, we see NGOs and independent researchers such as myself highlighting these campaigns and working together. Yes, we even see relatively established news organizations like the New York Times revealing that this was actually an Israeli government occupation. But what bothers me is, what's the point of recording all this when there's no accountability? Because what this becomes then is it's a documentation of impunity because we can say that these terrible things happened, but so what? And then it becomes a testament to impunity, not a testament to accountability. So it's very frustrating. So I'm not going to necessarily give the good news story now if there is one, but I'd be happy to come back to that or cycle back to that after some of the other contributions.
Thanks so much, Mark. And indeed, this question of accountability is very much a big one. And I hope we can get a little bit into that in a second as we look through what solution pathways we have. But Laith, I want to turn to you. You were working at Meta for several years, seeing from within the company how the company was dealing with this kind of campaigns, as well as more generally content about Palestine. Nadim mentioned that there has been many allegations by Hamle and many others of bias, a lot of which was substantiated by multiple reports of pro-Palestinian content being removed or otherwise penalized. A hearing from Nadim and Mark, I wonder if you could tell us a bit about the different mechanism which, in your view, can explain the company's actions as well as maybe the kind of outcomes that we've seen.
Assalamu alaikum. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. And thank you for the introduction. Yeah, I spent almost a decade working at Meta across different parts of the products and platforms that we have. So let me first, before getting into the mechanisms about how this kind of suppression ended up happening, let me give a big picture kind of framing for where we're at. So first and foremost, I want to acknowledge that Zionists have lost the narrative in an irreparable way, and it was lost not because of mainstream media, but because of social media. And this goes across the board, and this is also why the backlash has been so severe and so intense. Whether it's the TikTok acquisition, whether it's the whole Ellison and Barry Weiss saga with CBS and Paramount, whether it's even X hiring Nikita Beer as head of product, or all the things that we're going to talk about today. Netanyahu himself even said how important this social media battle is. So I want to take actually a moment before we get into it to actually acknowledge and thank and praise those people we can't thank enough, the brave Palestinian journalists, storytellers, the average people who did a service for all of humanity by the bravery that they enacted and continue to enact. So getting into it, I know you mentioned we're going to talk about solutions a little bit later, so I'll just focus right now on the mechanisms, and then we can touch on the solutions later. So first, let's start off with explaining a bit on how these mechanisms work. So I'll put them under three main pillars. First is policy, then is human enforcement, and then are the systems themselves. So on the policy side of things, I've honestly been I think it's very important that we understand these policies, which are actually published and can be read. So you can see, for example, things like the DOI policy, the hate speech policy, graphic violence, and the exceptions around those policies too. There's the Zionist as a proxy policy, and there's even other policies that we should discuss. I can go into detail on any of them that you're curious about, but just to kind of touch on it, even just understanding what a DOI is, a dangerous organization, an individual, and where that designation comes from, and the severity of the strikes against accounts with those violations is important to know. So there's the actual policies themselves, which do things, for example, like the Zionist is a proxy policy. You can read about it, but it gives the political ideology of Zionism the same kind of classification in certain contexts as an actual protected group, so like race or religion, which is unprecedented and not like any other kind of treatment. And there's bias in the policies themselves in those kind of ways. Then on the side of the actual people, the policy leaders, there are many. I'll use an example which some of you may know, which is Jordana Cutler. Jordana Cutler, her official title is Public Policy Director for Israel and Jews in the diaspora. She's supposed to represent the policy interests of those groups, but I have many Jewish friends and colleagues who do not feel represented at all whatsoever, and actually feel quite the opposite. She actually has a long history of working in the Likud party, and believe it or not, right before joining Meta, she literally worked in Netanyahu's office as a senior advisor. So there are many others with history in the 8200 unit and other aspects of the Israeli government and related apparatuses. So that's just a quick overview of the policy side of things. We can get into it more, but I think this is probably the most challenging one to kind of understand, but also one of the most important ones, because in many cases, a lot of the appeals and the exceptions and these kind of things are it's an uphill battle, but it's things that we need to understand, how the policy is being weaponized against anyone who tries to talk about the truth. Second is human enforcement. So these people are acting on policy, and it is a feedback loop that feeds into the automated systems. And many times this can be a bottleneck. I think Hamna actually published on this before, but different languages in different regions can get different kind of staffing. You could even the different types of people who are actually doing the human enforcement. There are many different elements in which there could be bias introduced into the human enforcement aspect, even if there are kind of guardrails against that. And I think that's something worth noting. And I think topping it all off are the actual systems themselves, which actually amplify the bias in the previous two mechanisms. So the thing is, there is no simple answer for questions people ask, like why is there shadow banning? Why there's so many different layers, and I think that's the important thing to realize is it's like death by 1,000 cuts, and then some of them are like really intense. And I think there are some very prominent examples that were even in the that were reported on in the news that people can go take a look at. But like, for example, at one point the word Palestinian was being actually translated by AI to terrorist, and a lot in some cases some of that those models are actually being trained on user data. So if this is something that is pervasive across the platforms, it can actually feed into these models, and I think that's worth noting. And I think another thing is that we actually have to start understanding these vectors and where they come from in companies. So for example, sometimes they're organic. So for example, the platforms will in general try to promote organic content over reshared content. And if you know about like what's happening in, obviously, like people are sharing news, which is like reshared content. People are sharing things that other people are posting, and a lot of the times that gets like downranked organically. However, I think the more concerning ones are obviously going to be the more systemic ones that we talked about already, like policy and human enforcement. But specifically, a lot of these systems come from the integrity and safety orgs within all of these social media companies. So if you look, for example, at TikTok, after the acquisition, they hired somebody who was formerly in the IDF to run that. In Meta, I just gave a quick overview of what's there. And if you look at many of these social media organizations, that actually is one of the main ways that people can kind of start to systemically introduce things that would be repressive to any kind of speech about Palestine or anything related to that. And I wanted, I don't want to go for too long, especially when we have such amazing speakers here on the panel. And so I just wanted to quickly kind of touch on this note, and then I'm happy to talk a little bit more about any of the details or even some of the solutions that we discussed. But I think at the end of the day, we have to understand that truth resonates with all. It's like a filter, and it's actually an advantage that I think sometimes we take for granted. And many times these systems have to work 100 times as hard to kind of convince people of lies, as we can see that are being shattered all around us. And that should actually encourage us to understand that it's an uphill battle. And I mean, I'll touch on it later, but I think some of the long-term solutions is having some kind of independence and sovereignty in the platforms that we use. And that's something that, there are efforts, good efforts, happening on that front. But also that we should recognize that, the truth itself has value in and of itself and will resonate with everybody. So anyways, I'll stop there and pass it back to you. And hopefully that was at least a little bit helpful in understanding some of the mechanisms being used.
Thanks so much, Lace. And yes, we will definitely go into the solutions. We don't want to just focus on the problem, but really kind of try to find a path forward. It's interesting because I spend quite a lot of time in Myanmar on my part, and listening to the three of you, there's kind of I'm struck by both, really. There are a bunch of parallels, but also some critical differences. And perhaps the primary difference is that Facebook had absolutely no problem looking at the Burmese military as a pariah regime in Myanmar, which is obviously not the same as what you're seeing with the Israeli authorities. And that definitely changes the dynamic here. One thing that I observed in Myanmar, which I'm also seeing play out in the context of Palestine, and that we haven't really touched on in the conversation so far, is that platforms are not just failing to remove many of the harmful content, but in many cases they're actually financing it. And if companies are going to be paying for harmful content via their monetization services, via their monetization program, I think that also adds an additional layer of complicity that is pretty important for us to look at as well. But again, as I said, I really want us to look at what are some of the pathways to solutions here. And perhaps this is a question for the three of you. In your view and from your very different vantage points, what do you see as the 2 to 3 priorities here? Perhaps the magic wand question here. Like, if you had a magic wand, what will you change first? Nadim, I don't know if we can start with you again.
Yeah, I think there are a few important pathways that we need to discover, and I think there are attempts to hold the companies accountable. And again, we need to understand that we are working in a different era. And maybe some of the companies who pretended like to care about something or to have some kind of conversation, like Meta, Microsoft, even Google to a certain extent, they don't anyway respond to the usual advocacy that organization did, the meetings trying to impact, etc. This is something, and this is not only for Palestine. This is something that have been happening, in different regions and the global phenomena. That organizations would show their result of their research and would recommend certain policies too. So this aspect is not happening anymore. It's not impactful. It's happening, but it's not impactful anymore. And organizations are going more and more towards more kind of aggressive, impactful, if I can define it in this way, pathways that would impact and make the companies change. And as one of those companies told me once in one of the meetings, the companies are looking only for court decisions and government decisions. What interests them is those two issues, because those two issues, they have to do a change in the policy. If, let's say, a certain government don't like their policy again and they are blocking them, so obviously the company is losing lots of money. If there is a court decision that is forcing them to compensate, for example, or to reopen certain accounts, or to have a huge fine on them, obviously this is something that is impactful. And for us, we need to look into those issues. So the legal actions is a top priority. Strategic litigation and regulation, these are things that we need to look into a much more serious way, trying to have more impact on the companies, because this is something that was not done, at least regarding our context, in a greater way. There are more opportunities on that aspect inside Europe rather than in the US, because of the legal system and the different regulations. For example, the DSA, Digital Service Act in Europe, the AI Act in Europe, that would allow civic society to hold those companies more accountable than before, and would open up opportunities in a way, like legally, to hold them accountable. And I think this is something that is really important. It starts moving. There are more and more cases, and this is something that should be invested much more. But this is one aspect. The other aspect that could be, and there are also some movement and some engagement, is the issue of shareholders and investor engagement. There are more and more organizations and more ethical investment houses who are trying to impact the company from inside, especially with the annual shareholder meetings and the other avenues. And this is like a kind of a more a spot where basically the leadership of those companies would find it very difficult to ignore, or just to say, no, this is not true, etc. So at least this is putting our issue on the agenda of those companies to try to deal and creating some kind of leverage or some kind of pressure point. I think tech workers themselves are also an important aspect, because tech workers and tech worker organizing, and we have been seeing in the last few years, some of them have been vocal and unfortunately also paid heavy prices, because of that and lost their jobs, and some of them are still inside the companies trying to impact. But this is also an important segment that we have to think about, and to be more coordinated in the system of the civic society, different elements. I mean, media pressure and public campaigns are also still important, despite that maybe they are not as impactful as they were in the previous years. But still, I think with cooperation, and sometimes we know that there are at least few of those companies, workers who have been leaking information and creating also a pressure and certain inconvenience for the companies. In the past, also specifically about Meta, we found that the oversight board was useful in specific cases. Those were not, changing the whole dynamic or in a structural way, but specific policies. And we can mention here the Shaheed policy change and from the river to the sea, the attempt to block it. So there were good cases. There were also cases that were less successful, but still maybe this is an even avenue to say. And lastly, I want to speak about the ethical alternatives. So in the past few years, there are more and more, I mean, there is also this discussion between pro-Palestine movement, like what to boycott, if to boycott, etc. And there are companies that at least currently are a bit too big to boycott totally, but still, I think ethical choices and new emerging social media platforms specifically are important for us to invest in. So in the past years, there was Mastodon and there was Blue Sky, though some people were also criticizing Blue Sky content moderation. And recently Upscrolled, which is a really important platform that lots of people are joining. And I think later in PDAF, we will have a conversation with the CEO of that platform. But those are platforms that we want them to grow and to have a critical mass, hopefully at a certain point, that they would be really competing those companies and creating more ethical, more transparent platform that we can use in a more safe way.
Thanks so much, Nadim. And I think, Lacey, I want to come back to the decentralization element in a second. But before we do that, Mark, I want to pick on you on this point that Nadim was making. So, I mean, Nadim, you talk about strategic litigation, shareholder engagement, tech workers engagement, to some extent media pressure, this ethical alternatives coming up. But Mark, you were commenting earlier on litigation or accountability in general, and like we have been compiling these filings of what's happening, and yet that's not necessarily translating into accountability, and that's probably even more true in the context of Palestine, where you have some of those campaigns being actually commanded by the Israeli authorities, right? So I wonder if you can react to that, and what do you see as a pathway to accountability through litigation in that particular context, where it's either the authorities that are actually running those campaigns, or what we're seeing increasingly is the authorities outsourcing to third parties, which is also kind of creating further distance from that activity.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree in the sense that I think obviously strategic litigation, the fact that these companies respond to financial pressures is generally more effective. Again, but I think, as you mentioned, especially when it comes to Myanmar versus Palestine, is the politicization, the fact at the end of the day that Israel is a US ally and mostly tech companies, not all, but most are Israeli allies, is going to complicate this picture. And I think it's worth mentioning, and it's perhaps obvious, that this is also the election of Donald Trump has thrown a spanner in the works, or further spanner in the works, in the sense that I would say the political protection now for big tech companies is perhaps even increasing. So we're seeing political pressure being put on the EU and the UK and the countries that do have things like the DSA or the GDPR or forms of legislation that are designed to hold tech companies accountable. So this might, in theory, and it is, I think, to some extent, trying to put pressure on those governments and companies to not try and police big tech so much. Although, to be fair, we are seeing, not necessarily in the domain of Palestine, but we are seeing recently these kind of cases where big tech companies have been fined. But, having said that, I do think we can talk about those big ticket sort of cases against Meta or X or Google. But I also think another way to do this is to sort of think, how can we propose legislation or have legislation be put forward that actually sort of gets at certain aspects of the way in which these companies operate. That's not necessarily going to happen in a way that's going to be overtly, not a compromise as such. But for example, let's say that, under Donald Trump in particular, we've seen companies roll back a lot on their content moderation and safety. I mean, this definitely started happening after Elon Musk took over X. But what if, for example, we could, some of those legislations could be better at ensuring that social media companies had to be more forthright and transparent? Because transparency isn't accountability, but it's a dimension of helping accountability of things like the monetization you mentioned. You mentioned so some of these companies are now paying people, but some of these companies like Google in particular are also taking money off, for example, the Israeli government to put out content and adverts denying salvation in Gaza, attacking UNRWA, genocide abetting content, right? But when you actually use their transparency tools, Google's ad library, Meta ad library, these are sort of, they're sort of terrible to the point that they're useless. And the whole point of these tools was at least it was meant to be giving civil society actors, whether academics or journalists, the ability to actually be able to compile and document cases that could then be, in theory, used to support legal cases or other cases, right? So instead of saying, like, jumping right to the front, so we need these kind of big legal cases, we need to create an infrastructure of documentation and transparency that can better help lead towards the accountability. Not that we shouldn't do those other things. I'm just trying to sort of find a way into this discussion where I can say maybe there's other ways we can sort of also approach this, from a civil society point of view. We need better documentation and transparency mechanisms that can then help organizations, law firms to either litigate or to actually raise awareness of the extent to which, for example, governments are manipulating and using, or in this case, not just the Israeli government, but those governments are exploiting these platforms for those purposes. So I think that was something good. And as someone who does data analytics, I've been really kind of disturbed by how deliberately poor some of these transparency systems are. I mean, it's just wild. I'm looking at like an anti-Palestinian campaign running on Meta. I was like, well, who else is, running ads from this Facebook page? You can't click on a button and it won't tell you. You Google transparency, you sort of think, oh, here's an ad that's problematic. How do I find out who's running the ad? Well, you can't unless you know who's running the ad. Which is, I mean, it's ridiculous because, Google is, sort of the premier search engine in the world, yet the ad library search interface basically means you have to guess a random string to be able to find the person who's running hate speech ads, right? Unless you know already. I mean, it's just so absurd that some of these basic things don't even exist yet. And sometimes it does feel like those tools, while simple, are going a small way to help us find accountability. And I think the thing is, when we look at hate speech, when we look at propaganda, when we look at genocidal information, there's so many little levels to how to approach this. We have to figure out legal ways of addressing them all. Just as one more example, if in the campaign I mentioned earlier, the Israeli government paid a firm to run this campaign. Now, if we had better documentation of, a corporate register or ledger that meant that these companies had to document, or register with those companies, and that had to be public knowledge, that would also be helpful. But it doesn't exist, right? There's so much secrecy here that's really unhelpful, and I just feel like, on these basic levels, we're still kind of way behind.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that struck me is particular in relation to Palestine, right, is you have companies like Meta that are members of GNI, the Global Network Initiative, and have made certain commitments about reporting on government requests. And if you look at, how many government requests came from the Israeli authorities for content takedown, you get something like 100. When really what happens is those requests are being made and then they get processed based on policies of the company. And then the companies might say, well, it violates our DOI policy, which is very broad, and count it as a policy violation, not as a government request. And then we end up with messy transparency or very limited transparency that doesn't really give us the full picture. Lace, I do want to come to you on that as well, because I'm sure there were many more requests coming from the Israeli than the few requests that are being documented on Meta's documentation, public documentation, obviously, but also talking about potential alternatives. I know that Blue Sky has been attempting a number of different things that are interesting in terms of making it possible to give the tool for content moderation to communities. We're now seeing as well, like more and more platforms emerging that are being developed in specific communities. I wonder what, from your position as a software engineer, and as someone that has been sitting there in the Silicon Valley, like, what do you see as pathways?
Yeah, for sure. So let me start off actually by addressing a couple of the really insightful comments that people have made. I think it was Dina who made a comment talking about tech giants claiming neutrality. I think there's no such thing as neutrality. That's a complete myth, to be honest. And especially as we see the big tech alignment with the military-industrial complex. You look into the Unit 201 formation. Some of the Meta executives are even on that. I want to touch on the core point here, which is that the ultimate solution, a lot of the things we're talking about are really important. We should pursue them, and I say that like with all the amazing things that the two speakers before me said, and Nadim touched on it too. But I think that really that's going to be an uphill battle, and the long-term solution is to find independence and sovereignty by building actual alternatives. And I think that Isam, who's going to be speaking here later, is a great example of that with Upscrolled. They have a few million users, and I want to remind people that you actually vote with your attention and with your eyes when you decide to use these platforms. So even I understand, and I say this as someone with dozens of martyrs from my family in Gaza, my wife and I's family in Gaza, that in many cases these social media platforms are a lifeline, because there are no journalists entering without the IDF, and at the end of the day, this is one of the few ways that what is happening in Gaza has gotten out. But I also want to acknowledge that long term we should be thinking about these alternatives, because at the we actually need to and like I said, because you're voting with your eyes and your attention, you have to, I would say, diversify that. Don't put all your attention and time in one basket. Don't expect one platform to be the solution, especially as through political pressure at the highest levels, with the administration changes, through the military-industrial complex, through all these kind of things. Don't expect things to magically change overnight, or even legal or human rights paths that as Nadim said, have become more and more ineffective over time to be the ultimate solution. So for the sake of just summarizing, I think we need to have our platforms that are not going to be claiming neutral, while also being in general biased against Palestinians through all the different mechanisms we discussed. And we can support that by number one, going and supporting them by actually being there and spending time on those platforms. Second, actually going and helping build those platforms, and if people have skills that they can contribute to that kind of thing, that would be a really effective way to actually make a difference here in the long term. So anyways, I'll pass it back to you, Victoria.
Thank you. And I'm just being told we only have 5 minutes, but actually to build on what you just said, I mean, yes, there is moving to new places that are actually better, but we also have questions about what can we do within the context of existing platforms, right, to better protect Palestinian voices, to make sure that they're not being shadow banned. I wonder if you have any insights on what we can tell our audience on what could be done from their side, from their perspective as well.
You're asking me, right? Okay. Yeah. So on this one, I actually think it's really important to understand the policies, the way that they're written, what a DOI is. Many people I've talked to don't even know what a DOI is when they post. There are cases like the Columbia SJP when it was taken down. Sometimes things as simple as an emoji can be, this sounds really unreasonable, but I actually want to clarify how extreme some of these, and how this is an ongoing and dynamic landscape. And like I mentioned, some of the policy leaders in the company who have direct backgrounds with the whether it's in the Likud party or the Zerg government, whatever it is, are also constantly working on these policies and changing these policies. So all that being said, my suggestion is to understand what are the common pitfalls that many people face. I think a lot of the times it takes there's not enough education or knowledge about that. Even sometimes the stated policies are ambiguous, things like that. So I think people like Hamla are doing a great job helping to clarify that. And I think what would be, I'm sure Nadim and other folks in Hamla have mentioned it before, but there are resources that I think can help teach creators hey, here are the common pitfalls that you can just simple things that they might come after you for. Also know the exceptions too, right? There are exceptions to, for example, the graphic violence policy when it comes to news. And I think even when you file your appeal, sometimes it feels like you're throwing it into the abyss. But it's the famous hadith, like even if the world is ending, but you have a plant in your hand, you should still plant it, right? So I think we should still try to plant, like to do what we can with the limited resources that we have, and understand, like I said, that this is an uphill battle, that we need to diversify our attention, because that's the number one way we vote, and invest it in other platforms as well, and in the long term, hopefully find alternatives.
Thank you. And just for those that are not familiar, DOI policy, that stands for Dangerous Organization and Individuals, and it's a very wide-ranging policy that sort of looks at support of terrorist and dangerous organization, and in the context of Palestine, that's often very much used to take some of the content down. So it's definitely worthwhile having a read through these policies and understanding how they work. I think that's been one of the biggest wins of the last decade or so, is to really kind of get those policies more explicitly documented on companies' websites. So at least we have a little bit more visibility on what is not supposed to be allowed. I know we are kind of running out of time, so I want to thank all our speakers for this fantastic session, and I'm sure there's so much more we could talk about on this, but hopefully we can we can take some hope in the fact that Meta and YouTube have actually just been found guilty on the basis of the design and operational decision they made in the US. So perhaps that's also going to be expanding the space for potential litigation and accountability moving forward. Thanks so much, Ryan. Again, it's been wonderful to have this conversation with you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.